Hello and welcome to the radiotimes.com Doctor Who podcast. My name's Hugh.
My name's Morgan. I'm back.
He's back and bigger than ever. No, he's the same size as what he was
Look,
before.
it's been a long and harsh lockdown, all right?
It's true. But now Morgan's back, and in special recognition of Morgan's return and in recognition of the day that we're recording this, which is the day before it goes out on various channels, we are celebrating Peter Davison, the fifth Doctor, because Peter Davison turned 70 on Tuesday, the 13th of April, 2021. If you're listening to this in the future, which is the day that we're recording this podcast. It will be up slightly after, but still, Peter Davison is 70. And that's a bit crazy because Peter Davison was always the really young Doctor. He was he was the youngest until Matt Smith, I think. And he was very youthful. That was sort of the point of him, was, he was, Tom Baker had been in the role for such a long time and had sort of definitely kind of made it his own, in a kind of real, like, iconic, I mean, that word is overused, but he really was iconic in his look and his style, and kind of, he was known around the world. And then to follow that, it was probably quite daunting. I can't really think, beyond maybe Matt Smith in the modern series, I can't really think of a time when, like, you've had bigger shoes to fill as a new Doctor coming in. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think Matt Smith is actually a really good reference point, because certainly at that period in the show's history, I think Peter Davison had the hardest job that any new Doctor had had. Previously, you'd had a relatively quick turnover of Doctors. You'd had every 3 or 4 years, you'd had a new Doctor. Whereas with Tom Baker having stayed in the role for 7 years, there were children watching Doctor Who that had never known any other Doctor. So not only was he incredibly popular, arguably at the time it's sort of the most popular Doctor there had ever been, but he'd been playing that role for so long that he was the Doctor to many people, not just the latest in a long line. So for Peter Davison to kind of have to step up and take on that mantle, it's definitely, I think, the closest comparison you could make in terms of New Who is Matt Smith, who was following on from David Tennant's hugely successful run. Interesting that in both instances they went for the youngest ever Doctor.
Yeah.
I think the contrast isn't quite as marked between Tennant and Smith as it is from Baker to Davison. But yeah, Peter Davison was 29 when he took it on, which I've never, it hasn't happened yet where a Doctor has been cast who is younger than me at the time they were cast. Now I'm in my 30s, so both Peter Davison and Matt Smith were younger than me when they were cast. But it's going to happen eventually where a Doctor is cast in their 20s now, and that'll make me feel really, really old. But yeah, I think Matt Smith was something like 27. But yeah, Peter Davison took on that mantle, and it could have been disastrous, but actually, credit to him, what he took it in a totally different direction to what Tom Baker had done. And I think, although, as you say, Tom Baker is this iconic classic series Doctor, a lot of what Peter Davison did in the 80s, you still feel the impact of that now, giving us the more youthful, the more dashing Doctor.
Definitely. I'm going to give some facts, some Peter Davison facts for anyone who's listening. So Peter Davison started in 1982, and his first regular appearance was in Castrovalva, which was the famous regeneration scene with all the papier-mâché lying in the field, the classic, as I'm sure the fans remember. And then he left in 1984 in the caves of Androzani. So 2 years, not the longest tenure of Doctors. I think that was the one that I think that David Tennant specifically wanted to beat, I think, which he pretty handily did. And then his companions included the ill-fated Adric, Nyssa, Tegan, Turlo, Chameleon, and Perry. So yeah, quite. I mean, they packed quite a lot in. It was 69 episodes in those 2 years. It's one of those funny things when the rumors were around about Jodie Whittaker possibly leaving. We were saying it's like she's not really been here, long enough, and she's been here longer than 2 years, but she's not done 69 episodes. She's done about 23 or something. And obviously the episodes were shorter back then, but I mean, she's probably done a similar number of stories, I guess, but obviously the stories are shorter. So Yeah. Anyway, but I think my point is I was quite shocked to kind of just see written down, because I'm not such an expert on the classic series. I've seen some stuff, but just to see, I know what an impact his Doctor had, and like you said, he's so influential today. The fact that he was only doing it for 2 years, I mean, after Tom Baker as well, who'd been doing it for such a long time,
Mm.
it's impressive, really.
I guess it's 3 years total, really, when you've got this sort of 82, 83, 84. So, but
But he left, like, he started on January 1982 and he left in March 1984. So it is basically
okay,
2
so
years and 2 months.
only a little over 2 years. I think, yeah, certainly coming after Tom, he wasn't looking to match that record. But Peter Davison has spoken about getting advice from Patrick Troughton, the second Doctor, who had told him only do 3 years or 3 series, because as you say, he did pack it in. He did, season 19, season 20, and season 21, all in that period, and across that period. Peter Davison really did, very quickly establish himself as a very different Doctor. That kind of youthful, dashing, much more vulnerable, certainly than later Tom Baker. That kind of the fourth Doctor became increasingly kind of all knowing, and all powerful and untouchable. And then Peter Davison gave it that real sense of kind of vulnerability, that something actually really bad could happen to the Doctor, that he wasn't always in control. And I think in his best stories, I think some of the best ones, you've got Earth Shock from season 19, which is the story in which Adric dies. Spoiler alert. And you've got Caves of Androzani, which is his final story from season 21. And in both of those, it's the Doctor really like up against it, and there's a real kind of sense of foreboding, of impending doom, that actually something really bad might happen here. The Doctor might not get out of this one. And in both instances, actually something bad really does happen, because in one a companion dies, and the other one essentially the Doctor dies. So I feel like he brought a real sense of kind of renewed jeopardy and excitement to Doctor Who.
I mean, we talk about Adric now as like he's the companion who died, right? Like that is something that kind of still stands. You've sort of had it technically happen a couple of times with people, and you've had sort of people leave in quite tragic circumstances. But I feel like he's still, I mean, he was definitely the first, but he's still the first, and I think more or less the only to just dies in one of the adventures and is just dead, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was a companion, there's Katarina from the 1960s, who she died in the Daleks' master plan, but had only been aboard the TARDIS. She'd only joined in the previous story, so it was a bit more of a sort of Adam Mitchell situation, where it's like, does that, in terms of certainly like a series regular, like a proper long runner going out, Adric was the first, and it was really daring, and as you say, it's kind of set the trend now. That it kind of for the first time made it clear that something like that could happen, and it's just one of the ways in which the Fifth Doctor really did kind of set a trend. We talked about him being an influence on new series Doctors. Stephen Moffat has said that. I think he said that Peter Davison was one of, if not his favorite Doctor. Certainly, I think he said that he thinks, in his opinion, Peter Davison is the best actor to have ever played the role. And David Tennant as well, before they were father and son-in-law, which is a whole different thing. David Tennant was a fan of Doctor Who, watching Peter Davison, and I think both in how Stephen Moffat writes the Doctor and in how David Tennant plays the Doctor, you can definitely see the impact of the Fifth Doctor. And with Time Crash, when they brought the Fifth Doctor back, you got to see that very explicitly referenced in these sort of fourth wall breaking scenes, where the 10th Doctor is saying, you were my Doctor and I copied you, essentially.
Yeah, because with the glasses and things like that. Yeah, because we were going to talk a bit about Time Crash, because so I haven't seen much Fifth Doctor stuff. It's a bit of a hole in my Doctor Who knowledge. And so Time Crash was pretty much, I think, one of the first times I saw him like in something, if that makes sense. Like I'd seen clips and stuff. Whereas I watched quite a lot of John Pertwee, which was for some reason repeated when I was growing up. But I sort of had big gaps. And yeah, so it was quite interesting watching that, because basically before we started recording, you kind of asked me what it was like seeing that as someone who didn't know him. And actually, I think the thing that the show did very well, the sketch, which I think Stephen Moffat wrote, Time Crash, was those similarities. It kind of, the thing that I think New Who has always done quite well with the old series is kind of framing it in a way that you can understand while not having seen the older series. For example, like, you know, you don't need to know all about the Time Lords. It's sort of explained in a clever way. And with this, it was very much like, you get who the Fifth Doctor is because it's the 10th Doctor meeting him, and you sort of see those similarities. Like, if you were just someone who just tuned into that on Comic Relief or whatever it was, you'd kind of get, you know, that there's been previous Doctors. You know, the reference to like, oh wait, you look much older now. Oh, it's because of time magic. You know, that you know, you don't need, that's for the fans. You don't need that. Like, whoever's watching just gets the idea that this is like a Doctor who's a bit like our Doctor, one of the older ones. Like, you kind of just get it. And I think it was something that was done really well. And to be honest, I kind of feel like it would be quite cool to see him back in the series again. I mean, as you know, obviously it's a bit tricky with the classic series Doctors because they've aged more visibly, but it doesn't necessarily matter. Like, you know, we've seen multi-Doctor stories before where people have clearly like got different hair colors and stuff, and you kind of just go along with it like two Doctors. And I feel like you said, of all the Doctors, I feel like he's the one I'd be most interested to kind of see come back. He's actually, I was going to say, I thought he was one of the only Doctor Who star that I'd seen, the only Doctor I'd seen on stage, but that's actually not true, like at all, because I saw David Tennant do Richard II, but I saw, when I went to see Legally Blonde the musical, he was the law professor, the horrible one, and he had a song, a solo, it's called like Blood in the Water. The only song, one of only two songs from that musical I remember. And you know what? He was really good. Did a really good American accent. I was very impressed. And I saw him again at the Doctor Who Symphonic Spectacular, or whatever they call it.
Yes.
One of the sort of concert thing. Yeah, and he hosted that. And he was very good at that as well.
I remember interviewing Peter Davison about that, and he was like really, really excited to be doing it. Like, it's a strange one where you think some actors would think, no, I'm an actor and I don't do this and I don't do that. But I remember how excited he was to take on that kind of that host role and host this big theatrical event. And you know, all of the Doctors, they're still involved in terms of like fan conventions and Big Finish and so on. But it does feel like, not least because his son-in-law is the 10th Doctor and his daughter is the Doctor's daughter, and all those very strange family connections they have there. But like, it really does feel as though, you know, Time Crash, I know it was a while ago now, but it's an example of how Peter Davison does still seem really, really engaged with Doctor Who and enthusiastic about it.
Definitely. I think maybe because he is used to that kind of on-stage showmanship and stuff, like he's quite good at that. I feel like maybe he's almost had a more public-facing role as a sort of elder statesman Doctor than some of the others have. You know, because he's only just turned 70, like he's still relatively young and everything. Like, he's kind of had these sort of hosting gigs, and obviously a lot of them do Big Finish now, you know, but basically all the surviving classic Doctors do Big Finish, don't they? But he, you know, has done it for a long time, and, you know, very successfully, and has carried on in lockdown, I think. So yeah, I feel like he's one of those people who's like, you say any ex-Doctor kind of stays the Doctor, right? We've said that before. You feel like with him that's particularly the case, because he was pretty behind that thing around the 50th anniversary special, wasn't he? The five-ish Doctors reboot.
Yeah, well, people were sharing anecdotes of today, it being Peter Davison's 70th birthday, of you know, times they'd met Peter Davison and so on, and I contributed my own, which was when it was the 50th, the day after the 50th, there was that big sort of Doctor Who celebration, and they were doing roundtable interviews with I think it was Peter Davison and Colin Baker and Sylvester McCoy, and I opened my interview with Peter by saying, Peter, obviously last night, you know, aired on BBC One, or aired on, you know, it went out to the public rather, a spectacular, emotional, and funny Doctor Who special, the Five-ish Doctors reboot, and he enjoyed that. I got a laugh out of him, which I was happy about. But yeah, Five-ish Doctors reboot, actually, that's a really good example of something he did, so, you know, more or less off his own back and made. And like, I think that the reason that you know, whatever you want to call it, that kind of comedy short is so beloved of fans, is because it is very funny, but it's also kind of shot through with affection for the show. And I think that speaks to how, I think you can surmise at least that speaks to how Peter Davison feels about Doctor Who, is that he does have this real affection for it, but always has a sense of humor about it, certainly, as well.
I mean, this is making me want to go back and watch that again, because I'm very fond of that little thing. I mean, I just remember like John Barrowman's in it, and they get Paul McGann, and they literally get everybody, don't they? I mean, Matt Smith's in it very briefly. They film him in a corridor to so go like, hello.
Yeah, no, Jenna Coleman's in it. Olivia Colman is in it.
Bizarrely,
there's a little prologue with Olivia Colman and Sean Pertwee. It's just Peter Davison sort of flicking through his celebrity pal Rolodex and getting absolutely everyone involved. No, that's a lot of fun.
I do really like it, and like you said, it does just show his kind of like connection to it, and it's also like he's very aware of like his position in the fandom. You know, he's very aware of like what people think of the former Doctors and kind of like what the fans want to see. I think do you know what I mean? Like, as in like some actors who star in a TV show wouldn't necessarily be that connected to the fans, or at least not well enough to know the sort, basically to be kind of one of them and to know the sort of thing they'd be interested in. A lot of Doctor Who actors are, not all of them, but quite a few.
Yeah.
You know, like you'd say similarly about like probably John Barrowman today. You know, like where they're just like, we're always giving back. Alex Kington to an extent, always kind of interacting with people, very aware, very connected. But you do really feel that with him as well. Like it really stands out. So obviously we've said I am not the biggest Fifth Doctor expert, and some of our listeners might not be either. And you touched on a couple of things, but I was wondering if there's any top tips, Morgan's top tips, must watch Fifth Doctor stories.
Yeah, so I think if we're looking at the 3 series, and considering, you know, let's take a standout story from each of his 3 series, I do think Earthshock is the one to go for from the first season 19, which is the penultimate story of that season. We've given away the big twist. Sorry, that Adric dies, and I'll give away the other big twist now. There are Cybermen in it.
What?
But that's just a really kind of fantastic, dynamic story. It's this kind of sci-fi action blockbuster, but as I say, really makes the most of it's a story that you can't imagine any other Doctor taking the place of the Fifth Doctor. And I think that always says a lot about, you know, a lot of the time, each Doctor's best stories are ones where you can't easily imagine swapping out another Doctor, because it only really works with them. Like let's say Human Nature, Family of Blood, to take a random example. You know, you could do it with other Doctors, and you know, it was initially a 7th Doctor story when it was a novel, but actually the reason I think it works so well, having John Smith be so kind of human and vulnerable, is because it's such a contrast to the brash, super, you know, uber confident 10th Doctor. And I think similarly, Earthshock is a story that really works best. The peril of Earthshock works best with the 5th Doctor. Like if it was the 4th Doctor, you kind of have a sense that everything's going to be okay, and you don't have that so much with Doctor number 5. So that's a real thrilling story. I think if you're looking at, I mean, it's not technically part of season 20, but let's throw it in there. I think the 5 Doctors, of course, is a great play. Actually, weirdly, it's, even though it's very sort of continuity heavy, I know a lot of people who Doctor Who fans who say it was the first story they watched, or one of the first stories they watched. I don't know if that's because it was the first story ever released on DVD. I don't know if that has something to do with it, but it kind of gives you a bit of an overview of, obviously it's Richard Herndl, not William Hartnell, but it does give you an overview of the first 5 Doctors, an overview of many of the monsters, of the companions. And it's, you know, it's one of those ones where it doesn't hold up. The plot probably doesn't hold up to a great deal of scrutiny, but it's just an enormous amount of fun. The 5 Doctors. So that's a good one. That's a nice follow-up to the slightly more gritty Earthshock. And then going back to the gritty, I think you have to give a shout out in his final season to The Caves of Androzani, which is his final story. And, you know, talking about the fact he only did 2 years, 3 series, Peter Davison has talked a lot about how when he read the scripts for Caves of Androzani, he was like, have I have I made a mistake here? Because it was, you know, in his opinion, it was so good that he was like, actually, if I, you know, if not to, you know, denigrate any of the scripts that had come before, but he was like, if I was doing stories like this every week, I would have stuck around for a 4th year or 5th year. And you know, that's a story that's often hailed as one of the best Doctor Who stories, if not the best Doctor Who story of all time. You know, it's certainly of the classic run. I have to say, I personally, and I may be, you know, hunted down for this, but it's one that I have mixed feelings about, because it's so dark. It's very, very grim, that story. And I think if you're after a bit of Doctor Who escapism, it's maybe not the one. I think, yeah, stick to 5 Doctors, but certainly, like, it's a really terrifically written story by Robert Holmes, some amazing guest performances, and I think pretty confidently you can say it's Peter Davison's best performance as well. Like, you know, he goes out strong. I think he really responds to the strength of the scripts, and yeah, a really, really, really strong performance. So those would be the 3 I'd suggest. If you're a Peter Davison beginner: Earthshock, 5 Doctors, Caves of Androzani.
There you go, very handy. I mean, it sounds like he went out on a high, right? Like, leave him wanting more.
Mm.
Don't like, you know, if he had stayed around for another year, he wouldn't have ended on such a strong story. And like the sort of slight thing of like, could he have done a bit more? Could he have kept on? You know, could he have kept on at that level? Just isn't there in the same way. You know, you kind of you keep that nice uncertainty about what might have been, and then you get Big Finish to see him do lots of stuff anyway. So yeah, I mean, happy birthday, Peter Davison. Thanks for all the Doctor Who episodes and conventions and things. We really appreciate it. We didn't get you anything apart from this podcast.
The shower of praise.
Imagine if someone got you a podcast about them for your birthday. I mean, or for that. Yeah, I mean, what a nightmare. I mean, don't get any ideas if you're listening at home. But what do you think, listeners at home, or, you know, you can be in gardens now, last time I checked, you know, listeners at home or in gardens, but outside still. Are you a big fan of Peter Davison, or are you, you know, now interested, based on Morgan's recommendations, in checking out some 5th Doctor stories? And yeah, you know, if you are an old school fan of Peter Davison, what are your favorite stories? Do you agree with our selection, or do you think people should check out some others? Please let us know in the comments. You probably listen to this on YouTube, but we also have it hosted on radiotimes.com, which is our website, hence the name of the podcast. And also it's on things like Spotify and Apple Podcasts and iTunes. I don't know. It's on lots of things. You know where you're listening to it. I don't know why I tell you this. You're already listening to me. If you weren't, that would be weird. Unless you're just in the room with me and trying to find out where you can hear me talk again. But I don't think you are. I hope you're not. Anyway, thanks very much for listening to us talk on. I've been Hugh.
I've been Morgan.
And neither of us has been...